If you really want to understand critical race theory, you have to go back in time.
Their mission was to reestablish white domination, and they did that by monitoring every book in every classroom in the South.
From the African American Policy Forum, I'm your host, Kimberly Crenshaw. This is the United States of Amnesia, a miniseries explaining what CRT really is and what our reaction to it says about America's future. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, so here we are. Sara and I are currently on J.D. Vance's LinkedIn page.
Stalker time.
Has 3,828 followers. Here it is, co-founder and partner of Narya.
What is Narya? I actually don't know. Isn't it interesting that he doesn't put U.S. Senator? Venture capital. 4 years and 8 months.
I don't think so. He was a U.S. Marine, or he was enlisted in the U.S. Marines Corps. He's an author, co-founder and partner of Narya, went to Yale Law, graduated from...
Just like Bill Clinton.
Yeah. Ohio State University.
He has 2 linked articles, Why Trump's Anti-War Message Resonates with America, and Trump Speaks for Those Bush Betrayed, from 2016.
Okay, that's enough stalking this guy.
I officially accept your nomination to be Vice President of the United States of America.
That was J.D. Vance last week at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Welcome back to Nationally. I'm your host, Juan Diego Ramirez, independent journalist.
And I'm also your host, Sara Sadhwani, political science professor at Pomona College. In this limited election podcast series, produced by Immigrant Media, we discuss issues that matter to some of the most overlooked immigrant and minority communities in the U.S.
And as the election season continues, we'll examine key moments that offer insight into what to expect in November.
In today's episode, we'll be giving you the rundown on Trump's pick for VP, J.D. Vance, the 39-year-old senator from Ohio.
But who is J.D. Vance? And as someone who identified as a never-Trumper, why did he change his mind?
And what does it mean for the Trump VP pick to be married to an Indian-American woman and have Indian-American kids? We are your hosts. I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And I'm Juan Diego Ramirez. And this is Nationally.
We've always had a good chemistry. And originally, JD was probably not for me, but he didn't know me. And then when we got to know each other, he liked me maybe more than anybody liked me. And he would stick up for me, and he'd fight for the worker as much as I fight for the worker. We just had an automatic chemistry.
Yep. J.D. Vance is that 39-year-old senator from Ohio.
And according to his LinkedIn and our fact checkers, he was in the Marines before going to Ohio State for his bachelor's degree and Yale for his JD.
So, Sara, vice presidents are usually set up to balance the ticket.
When we talk about balancing the ticket, usually what we're talking about is bringing in voters that would have reservations about voting for the person at the top of the ticket, right? So in 2016, Trump, who maybe with his extravagant lifestyle turned off evangelical voters, chose Mike Pence because he is that classic Republican with a strong relationship to the religious right and the conservative right. In this instance, you're absolutely right? He had this opportunity to show a Republican Party doing outreach. He could have chosen Tim Scott, who is a Black American, to do additional outreach to, in particular, Black men who have been supporting the Republican Party in larger numbers. He could have picked Marco Rubio, who could have helped him with a strategy reaching Latinos in Arizona and Nevada. Instead, he picks J.D. Vance, which is really just a doubling down on the MAGA Republican Party. And that was on full display at the RNC, that this is the party of Trump, this is the party of MAGA. And in all likelihood, J.D. Vance, being this younger man who has fully embraced the MAGA ideology, is the future of the MAGA Republican Party. We're not going back to country club Republicanism. This is the Republican Party for today and the future. I mean, many are referring to him as the heir apparent of the MAGA Republican movement because he is this younger voice. And in doing so, Donald Trump kind of skipped over Gen Xers and went straight in for this millennial man.
To me, it sounds as if Trump has this idea that he already won. That by choosing J.D. Vance, he's choosing the future of the Republican Party as if there's no other walls that they can come against. So I don't know, is J.D. Vance the right pick?
I think it shows Trump's hand and his strategy on how he's going to win. He won those states which have been known as the, quote, blue wall: Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Ohio, Pennsylvania, maybe even Virginia. He has had a lot of success there back in 2016. Biden, who's always had these long relationships in places like Pennsylvania, was incredibly fortunate to win that back in 2020. And I think this pick of J.D. Vance really shows Trump doubling down, yes, one, on the MAGA republicanism, but two, on the strategy to go after these states with large working class white populations, and in some ways really let go of some of the states, Georgia, Nevada, some of these other states that could potentially be in play with growing Latino communities, with Asian Americans, with Black Americans, and saying, I'm going for the mother lode in this blue wall.
So in 2016, Vance gained some fame from his book called Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir about growing up poor with his grandmother in rural Kentucky and Ohio, Appalachia.
And this was also made into a movie in 2020.
I know I could have done better. But you got to decide. You want to be somebody or not?
And I did have the chance to watch it a couple nights ago on Netflix. Have you seen it?
I have not seen it. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah. First off, I was just fascinated by the characters and the folks involved in the production of this film. I mean, we had Glenn Close, Amy Adams. It was produced and I think directed by Ron Howard, music by Hans Zimmer. So these are some big Hollywood names that took on J.D. Vance's story. And there was plenty that I could identify with. He was originally from Appalachia in the hills of Kentucky, and then moved to Ohio, which is the Rust Belt states. And that's where I grew up too, where there were plenty of folks who had really been left behind by the economics of the regions, which were very much depressed during the 1980s as industries left the Rust Belt. Those who were left behind often had difficult circumstances. Drug addiction is absolutely something I hear a whole lot about, continuing even today to rage throughout the region. And he basically calls himself a hillbilly because of it, right? Because he's from these rural areas. And he identifies with this major component of support for Trump, the MAGA base, which has talked a whole lot about lower income white folks throughout that region.
So now in 2016, when he wrote this book, and at this time, he still was a never Trumper. And it was the same year he wrote the book that, he famously also wrote an article for The Atlantic where he compared Donald Trump to heroin. And I mean, not in the good way. You just talked about how that was one of the subjects in the movie.
That's right. He wrote this article in The Atlantic called Opioid of the Masses, comparing the hysteria and addiction to Donald Trump to heroin addiction. He wrote, during this election season, referring to 2016, it appears that many Americans have reached for a new pain reliever. It, too, promises a quick escape from life's cares, an easy solution to the mounting social problems of U.S. communities and culture. It demands nothing and requires little more than a modest presence and maybe a few enablers. It enters minds not through lungs or veins, but through eyes and ears. And its name is Donald Trump.
That is very, very powerful. It also gets worse, right?
Yeah, I mean, are you talking about the Hitler comment?
The Hitler comment. Yeah, I mean, he once told a friend in a leaked Facebook message that he was scared that Trump could be, quote, America's Hitler and, quote, a cynical asshole. I mean,
those are strong words, right? Vance has talked a lot about Trump in the past 8 years. So, of course, we have all these great clips of him talking about it, specifically because his book about growing up in poor white areas was full of the type of people who would likely vote for Trump. So he was often interviewed, obviously he's changed now, about why Trump wasn't the solution for those poor white communities or for the nation.
Have you been surprised by how successful it's been?
Yes. How could I not be?
Why do you think?
I'm sitting here talking to Megyn Kelly. This is great.
He also tweeted in 2016 during the infamous Muslim ban. Vance had said, "I find him reprehensible," saying that Mr. Trump made immigrants and Muslims in the United States feel afraid.
and then Trump won the election. And Vance tweeted, quote, "In 4 years, I hope people remember that it was those of us who empathize with Trump's voters who fought him most aggressively."
And now in 2024, he is Trump's vice presidential pick. So people can change, JD.
Yeah, and he really has. So let's talk about how JD Vance changed his tune, his lyrics, everything over the past 8 years. It was about 2 years later in 2018 that he started warming up to Trump.
And then it was 2 years after that, in 2020, that they start supporting one another. First, Vance supports Trump's re-election bid, and then Trump endorses Vance as he ran to be Ohio senator.
Like a lot of people, I criticized Trump back in 2016, and I asked folks not to judge me based on what I said in 2016, because I've been very open about the fact that I did say those critical things, and I regret them, and I regret being wrong about the guy. I think that he was a good president. I think he made a lot of good decisions for people, and I think he took a lot of flack.
Okay, so it was Vance who supported Trump first, and then Trump endorsed him back.
Tonight, a major endorsement in Republican politics. Donald Trump backing J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy.
I'm running to be your next U.S. Senator for the state of Ohio.
Yeah, and then Vance said he was incredibly honored, those are quotes, apologized for his comments, and deleted many of his tweets.
Okay, so in terms of the timeline, we're now talking about November 2020. Trump loses the presidential election, even though, of course, he claims the election was a fraud.
Yes, and J.D. Vance repeatedly supported those false claims that there were, quote, certainly people voting illegally on a large-scale basis, unquote. You know what? That is absolutely not true. There has been no verification of that.
Okay, so let's go back just a little bit. One more time. Remember back in 2016 during the Muslim ban when Vance criticized Trump for scaring immigrants?
Of course. Who could forget that?
Well, 6 years later in 2022, after the endorsement and apologies and deleted tweets, Vance also pushed to finish Trump's border wall. So he no longer supported expanding immigration.
And you have to ask yourself who's benefiting from this and who's getting rich from it. And there's two big answers. First of all, Chamber of Commerce style Republicans and Democrats who love the cheap labor, who love the fact that these immigrants are displacing America's workers, but also Democrat politicians who have decided that they can't win re-election in 2022 unless they bring in a large number of new voters to replace the voters that are already here.
I mean, JD, I'm just wondering, what does Usha Vance, his Indian American wife, think of all this? The whole thing stinks of opportunism.
It's safe to say that neither JD nor I expected to find ourselves in this position. But it's hard to imagine a more powerful example of the American dream.
So when we come back, we'll discuss Usha Vance, the Indian American woman married to J.D. Vance.
And who gets to be embraced as a quote-unquote good immigrant and alienated as a bad immigrant.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
We're back, and we just finished talking about J.D. Vance and how he went from being a never Trump guy to Trump's running mate.
And now we're going to talk about Usha Vance, J.D. Vance, a 38-year-old spouse.
And who gets to be embraced as a quote-unquote good immigrant and alienated as a bad immigrant. One of the things that J.D. Vance, he had put out this commercial about the left wants to call us racist, but we're not racist.
Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans?
You saw that?
Yeah. Many of us in the culture, Mexicans, we laugh. It's a sort of defense mechanism where we just laugh at things that go horribly wrong instead of getting mad over it. But yes, when it comes down to it, Mexicans are always used as the example of immigration, when in fact, the number of Mexican immigration has been dropping for more than a decade now. Less Mexicans are coming in the US than many other countries. And if you ask someone who has a racist mentality, the picture of an immigrant is usually a Mexican. We are the face of immigration. When the truth of the matter is, immigrants coming into the United States are very diverse. So, yeah, J.D. Vance said this back a few years ago, but that's something that we heard even this past week here at the Republican National Convention.
The lack of good jobs, of course, led to stagnant wages. And then the Democrats flooded this country with millions of illegal aliens. So citizens had to compete with people who shouldn't even be here for precious housing.
There's this professor of American Studies at Amherst College, Pawan Dhingra. I said to NBC, there are good immigrants and there are bad immigrants, and the Republican Party is just trying to embrace, quote unquote, good immigrants. And it absolutely plays into this model minority myth that often gets put on Indian Americans in particular, and to Asian Americans, I would say. But this is dangerous in so many ways, right? Like as if Indian immigrants have no issues whatsoever, which is 100% not true, and really sets up this narrative between who did it the right way, who did it the wrong way, who's the good immigrant, who's the bad immigrant, and this elitism that absolutely does play into all of these racist stereotypes. And while President Trump had talked about immigrants from quote unquote shithole countries, that's incredibly problematic and hurtful to the millions of immigrants who come from the countries he was referring to. So I think what was so on display for me was to see these spouses, right? Melania Trump, who was an immigrant herself, who only showed up the last night and didn't say anything notably during the RNC. Usha Vance, who is the daughter of immigrants and really represents the immigrant story, but being there as these silent spouses who ultimately are complicit in their husbands' campaigns that are scapegoating immigrants and allowing them to do so.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Usha comes from a liberal background. Like up to 2014, she was a registered Democrat. She went to Yale. She worked at a, I guess, quote unquote, liberal
firm, I think, yeah, in San Francisco, the mecca of liberal politics.
The mecca of liberal politics. And she was there until she resigned because J.D. Vance was picked to be Trump's vice president.
My background is very different from JD's. I grew up in San Diego, in a middle-class community. With two loving parents, both immigrants from India, and a wonderful sister. That JD and I could meet at all, let alone fall in love and marry, is a testament to this great country.
It's interesting to me how someone with a liberal background from California, San Diego. I mean, I know San Diego is like a purple city, but who went to Yale Law, who worked for this liberal organization, then turns and supports her husband. I mean, right now we have, at the moment, maybe two very powerful Indian American women. The Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, a possible second lady. So like, as a fellow daughter of Indian immigrants, like, what are your views on the rise of the Indian American community? And it's interesting to see both extremes.
Look, I've done a bunch of research. One of the big findings of my own research is that Indian Americans want to see more Indian Americans elected to office regardless of political party. We've talked about it before on this podcast. Indian Americans predominantly identify with the Democratic Party, but at the same time, there's also a strong level of support for Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who is very much seen as a Donald Trump-like figure. And so that's a real contrast for Indian Americans themselves. Clearly, we're pumping out folks who have ambition to be involved in politics, donors, especially coming out of Silicon Valley. But let's not also forget, even in places like Georgia and the Carolinas, who are also giving a whole lot of money to political campaigns. This could potentially be a community that could start shifting towards more support for Republicans. Indian Americans want to see more Indian Americans regardless of political party.
As we've talked about throughout this podcast, communities are complex. We talked about this with Latinos. You've mentioned before the Vietnamese community, who tends to be one of those communities lean to the right more than other Southeast Asians. But yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris, Nikki Haley, different sides of the spectrum of the Indian American community. We're not a monolith. Thanks for listening to this episode of Nationally Podcast, brought to you by Immigrants Media.
We hope you liked this episode. Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms.
If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com or reach out to our socials at @immigrantlymedia on Instagram and at @immigrantly_pod on X.
You can find me on the socials at Sara Sadhwani.
And you can find me on socials as well at JUANDR47.
Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan and Sofia Sanchez. This episode was written and researched by Sofia Sanchez.
Our sound designer and editor is Juan Velez. The Nationally theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound. Thanks for listening and see you next week.